I appreciate Mennonite Central Committee, but I belong to the United Church of Canada, and our church has been very supportive of the Palestinians, although I know that in my own congregation we will argue about the situation, but my church in general is very supportive. What have you learned about Christian churches in Canada and the United States?
How Palestinians may be perceived, the West, perceived Canada and the United States. I should say before answering that I'm also half American. My mother is an American woman who is white from European heritage. So my perception may be a bit skewed. But nonetheless, Palestinians, I believe, are quite good in differentiating between the politics, the government, and the people. And also oftentimes when we speak, for instance, even though Canada is complicit in the occupation, the big dog is Trump and the US. So oftentimes when we're speaking about the West, we're talking about the states, the United States of America and Donald Trump. And one of the phrases that many Palestinians throw out there is they just know nothing about us. And then you hear a Palestinian go to America, is coming back, especially if they're from a rural community. They come back and their friends are like, well, how was that, We see on TV, we hear about all the problems that people face, the indigenous communities and the people of color. And then you'll hear the Palestinians say, you know what, they're actually a very nice people, they just know nothing about us. They don't even know they know nothing about us. And so, as you were saying, you're from the United Church of Canada, and the United Church of Canada, we actually have partners with them, partnership through our organization. And so we do know of quite a few churches which are supportive, quite a few churches which even send international volunteers to come and live with us, to come and experience life with us, such as the World Council of Churches Ecumenical Accompaniment Program, Palestine, Israel. But at the same time, we still have the very influential voices of the governments in general, which are directly affecting our reality, for the most part, in a negative direction. And so that is also what we focus on. And this is something you can see in our churches, in our mosques, and even in our schools. So I go to church on Sunday, and here we often, or in the West, we talk about secularism, the separation of state and church, and we talk about keeping politics outside of the church. In Palestine, we don't talk about that because we see politics as our life and influences our life, and international politics and policies have direct effects on our life. So just to give you an example, when Trump decided to move Jerusalem, the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the Palestinians protested. In Bethlehem, there were clashes for almost 2 days. And so as a result of this, some of the Israeli companies decided to cut water that day to some of the Palestinian communities in Bethlehem. My friend is the director of the Palestinian Water Authority for Bethlehem. And so the way we currently have it is you have these water tanks that you store the water in. And so in Bethlehem, on average, you receive it once every 14 days. For those communities within Bethlehem that were supposed to receive water those 2 days, they now have to wait 28 days. Something happens in Washington, a decision, and I believe his wife or daughter, I forget which one, came to Israel, to Jerusalem to celebrate this occasion. And then you have these people who would like to voice their unhappiness and their pleasure with this unjust situation. And then there is this system of oppression which is funded in part and supported by these Western governments and some, again, emphasis on some churches and church communities, which then allows for the Israeli occupation to allow for these companies with the water that in large part has been confiscated from the Palestinian territories. 90% of the water resources have been confiscated from the West Bank by Israel, and then a portion of that is sold back. And so the Israeli occupation, with all the support that it has, gave these companies the right to cut water that day because they didn't like people's right to freedom of speech or to show their disdain with what is happening. And so within that, oftentimes when we speak, even though we have this community of support, there are a couple of things to think about. That there are still those, and those with maybe more influence and power at the moment, who do not support justice, and who do not help, and even work actively against our livelihood. But then you also have the quality of support. Not to say that the United Church of Canada is lacking quality or that sort of thing, but also that there's always more that can be done. And what we oftentimes see with quite a few church organizations or church groups, they are willing to support us to an extent. And so sometimes we see that support extends to a place in which they're comfortable, and stops to when they have to make a tough decision or have to do something which may put them in an uncomfortable position. And so that also further causes some dissatisfaction within the Christian community and causes some more division between the Christians in Palestine and the Christians internationally. But again, we are very appreciative of the support and hope that you will continue supporting us and that we will continue building relations and working towards a brighter, better future. And so we thank you.
And live in their own concentration camps. Like the settlements are essentially walled, luxurious concentration camps. They separate themselves from the rest of the people in the country. What do you think about that? Like what responsibility did we not carry out to deal with our own racism and anti-Semitism to begin with?
So what we need is to look at the racist frameworks. And yes, if only the West would have dealt with some of their racist frameworks 100 years ago, I think most of the world would have looked a bit better. And if it was a few hundred years ago, even before that, then also this continent would have looked a little different. But I don't think that there's much of a point of saying what if. That's not what happens. I think now the question is, what is your responsibility now? And for me, that's exactly the same responsibility. Fight racism in all of its different forms, including what does it mean today here, as far as people of color are concerned, as far as indigenous people are concerned. Today, a lot of what we're seeing around us is a lot of Islamophobia. There are a lot of different forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, that are still very much part of your society, and that is your responsibility.
There's something else that occurred to me. Supposing the Israelis succeeded in their plan of their wish of total ethnic cleansing. Supposing they got anybody who was not Jewish out of Israel, out of Palestine, who would they fight then? Each other?
I don't think that anyone in Israel generally has a long-term plan, but I think that that also includes not having a long-term plan of not having Palestinians around. I don't think that there's any Israeli politician, including the extreme right, that actually see in their mind an option where the land is ethnically cleansed. I think that when we kind of hear right-wing politicians where their visions are going is into a far more, I would say, economic solution. One of our politicians, Naftali Bennett, he's the Minister of Education at the moment, and he kind of put out a plan, and mainly the idea is continuing to close Palestinians more into the cities, the more densely populated areas, annexing Area C and the kind of less densely populated areas, and at the same time, widening checkpoints, having more and more checkpoints that will be more efficient, allow Palestinians to pass in less time, kind of all these kind of welfare-y ideas that allow much more Palestinian employment in Israel, more convenient Palestinian employment in Israel, and continuing to make use of Palestinians as a resource, right? You don't need to ethnically cleanse it, as actually there's advantages of not doing that from a capitalist perspective. So I think it is important to also think in those terms. The other aspect of it, of kind of the more philosophical question of, right, who will they fight, is that, I mean, we fight each other ourselves all the time as well. Racism is not just towards Palestinians. There's a huge amount of racism, like in any society, internally towards Israelis. When we look at the state of Ethiopian Jews and how they suffer from police brutality, when we look at the case of both Yemenite and other Mizrahi countries, Jews from Arab countries whose babies were kidnapped by the state in the 50s and are still looking for information about this, and this is still not given by the state, and that there's all kinds of layers of other forms of discrimination and racism. So I'm afraid people always manage to find the other and how to kind of build their own power as opposed to that other. And so I think that really the question for us is how do we kind of step out of a racist framework generally, and definitely for us as the Israeli Jewish society, but I'm sure this is also true for societies here. And I think I might connect that to your question. So if we think about kind of, yes, the fear that Israelis grow into, and I think it's important to say will be very hard for us to ever step out of. And I think that part of the reason, or to step out of in the status quo, I think that part of the reason for me that it's important for me to speak to international audiences is because I actually don't believe that my society will change without an external factor that will push it to do so. I think that we are in a very comfortable place in many ways. We don't need to change. There's no reason for our education system to change and then for generations to be able to change that consciousness. So we'll continue to live in that fear.
So I use that, I guess, to bring in a couple of questions. One is around military embargo and sanctions related to military embargo. Just during the presentation you provided here in Canada, a year ago, the Canadian BDS Coalition, which has about 30 organizations, did end up having Air Canada and a contract 2 years into a 5-year contract to service all of our commercial jets at IAI, which is the Israeli Aerospace Industries, the main state-owned military organization that you were talking about. So that's the kind of complicity that we have and the kind of action that we need to be taking here. So I haven't heard us talk about boycott, divestment, or sanctions in your conversation.
As far as arms embargoes, first of all, I think, yes, these are really important campaigns. I do want to mention that generally, arms embargo campaigns and specifically the legal framework that exists in most places in the world, including here in Canada that you were speaking of, can only do about half the work in the way that we usually talk about it, because usually when we talk about it, we talk about not exporting to human rights violating countries. And that is what exists today in the Canadian legal framework. I think what we need to also remember is that in Israel's case, and it's not the only place, what we actually also need is for you to not import from those countries, right? So the idea is it's not just you don't want to sell arms to human rights violating countries, it's that also at the same time you don't want to profit from weapons that were tested around human rights violations. And so I think that that's an important thing to add to the discourse generally. When we speak about these things, it is important to say that it's harder to do campaigns around military industry because unlike a lot of other boycott or divestment campaigns where the general argument is we're asking a company to change their policy to be more moral, with military companies, that's not really an ask. Like what they're doing around the world everywhere is terrible. And so there it's important to remember that what we're actually asking is for either governments to change their policies that will still be terrible, right? It's a different discourse. It's not asking to stop doing something. It's asking, please buy it from a different company that violates human rights a little bit less. And it's a problematic discourse for us, but important for us to admit that that's what we're doing. And mostly also to remember that this is not just about the boycotts or the divestment, it's about the awareness raising that we can do when we talk about these things. It's about building the solidarity between people when we talk about campaigns against companies. So even if it's not something that we can actually create the economic change in a specific campaign, which often is what happens, We've done the political work around it, and it is what will allow later on for other political changes, including other successful campaigns. So I just want to say, you know, if we think about kind of the big picture, it's not that every campaign has to have that kind of success. We can measure success in other ways as well.
Just to add a little bit about BDS, thank you for bringing it up. I'm assuming everyone has heard of BDS boycott, the divestment and sanctions. One of the very important things that I like to bring up, that it's not to bankrupt these companies, but it's a tool, it's not the end goal, but it's to cause enough economic change that these companies and their associates have to ask what's going on here, why is this happening, and then to see that they're staying with this occupation. And so then choose to change their policies or who they support and who they're affiliated with because of the economic changes that they're suffering. So what's become more evident to us as Palestinians, we're powerless. Change cannot happen or cannot be changed from within us, from within our power, because we lack this power. But what can happen is that we have this occupation that can only exist and continue because it is funded, because it receives this funding, and because it has this support network. And so many of you belong to churches, organizations, you come from homes. If you don't have the money to do something and you can't get a loan, then you can't do it. And so while we're waiting for societal change, while we're waiting for social change, at least to end the occupation. And so within this, within this, trying to give Israel, or the Israeli occupation, economic incentive to change through the companies, trying to defund the Israeli occupation so that the occupation cannot continue its unjust occupation of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian territories. And so with this, but I do think it's important, every organization has reasons as to why it doesn't support BDS. And I'm a proponent of BDS and I support it, but I also think that for those who cannot, it's important to ask why. It's important to talk about what it is and why you can support it, and not stop there, but say, okay, if I cannot get behind this for reason A through Z, then what can I do? How can I influence change?
And just while I know Rachel wants to say, I just want to also say, yes, there are churches here in Canada that have taken a stand, including divestment resolutions and boycott resolutions. So just to say that is also happening. So just don't want to erase the work that is being done.
This is just a small question. You said that teachers were rewarded for the enlistment stats on their students. Doesn't everybody have to enlist? Or is the government so nervous about the very few refusings?
Over 50% of the citizens of the State of Israel don't serve in the military. Yes, there's mandatory service, but part of that is populations that are not drafted, right? So 20% are Palestinian citizens of Israel that are just not drafted. 13% are ultra-Orthodox Jews who continue to study in higher religious education. 6% are religious women who are automatically exempt. And then we have 12% who either don't start or don't finish their military service on the grounds of mental health, because that's the easiest way out of service. So the reality is, even of the Jewish population, we're talking about 64% enlistment rates. And so no, a lot of people don't serve. And yes, that is something that constantly the state tries to deal with, and part of it is public campaigns, billboards, whatever, saying there was a huge campaign called True Israeli Doesn't Dodge the Draft, just to clarify what being Israeli actually means. And so that's always part of the discourse. I think it is important to say this is a social and a political need and not a military one. Once every few years, the military has this committee of how to become more efficient, and always one of the first recommendations is become a professional military, right? From a military perspective, that's where militaries around the world are going to. And yet in Israel, that's not a discourse. because militarism, again, conscription, it's a social need. Everything that we talked about before needs conscription for it. So even if you don't have everyone actually serving, you need the idea or you need the concept that everyone serves. So that's just kind of important to mention that.
I think that is one of the things that is enraging me these days is the way that the mainstream Jewish communities are changing the definition of anti-Semitism, right? So that any critique of Israel is synonymous with anti-Semitism. And the power of that is unbelievable to me, like how effective they're being in silencing people and silencing criticism of Israel with that. And for us as Jews, I don't think it's quite as hard, because we just get called self-hating Jews, right? And we're used to that, and we don't care, really. But I think it's interesting in this environment where there's a lot of Christian people who are working on this issue. I think it can be have a very silencing impact. So I don't know, I just wanted to raise, because sometimes I feel like the way that they have used that so powerfully feels like such a barrier. So how can we, I guess, unite in our communities to combat that move that they're making so powerfully?
I think that it is really important for us to differentiate and continue to articulate how different Israel's policies are, the concept of Israel, Zionism, and Judaism, and saying these are all different things. And I mean, we can see that with the fact that, that there's Jews around the world who are not Israeli, who are not Zionist, and who have absolutely nothing to do with Israeli policies. There are people who are Israeli and against those policies. There are people who are Israeli and are not Jewish. There are people who are Zionist and pro those policies and are not Jewish. Like, there's all those variations, and the attempt to say this is all one thing. Sure, it's a very useful thing for Israel to do, and it's powerful and it works. But I think it's also important for us to say not only is it detrimental to our cause and to kind of calling for an end to occupation, it's also detrimental to actually attacking anti-Semitism, real anti-Semitism, because if you kind of say this is all one thing, then anti-Semites become legitimate, right? Anti-Semites that can say, oh, we're actually just criticizing the occupation. And if it's all one thing, then that's somehow, like, to really address anti-Semitism, we need to do that out of an anti-racist framework. And an anti-racist framework needs to be genuine, and in this case, it also will be pro-Palestinian, because that is where we see the racism being used most strongly in this context. But it's great that I'm saying that to you, but everyone here knows that. I think a lot of the question is how do we, I think in many ways, give people the support and give the political system the support that they need to be able to say that they see those differentiations. Because what's actually happening is not a question of the definition of anti-Semitism, it's a question of a lot of power, a lot of effort, a lot of PR companies that are working on convincing people that it's all the same thing. And that's what we're facing. And it's a difficult thing to face, but I think that because I'm very naive in what I'm about to say, I think that because common sense-wise we're right, we can make that argument, but I don't know, in a post-truth era, I might be wrong, and I'm not sure I have answers on kind of how to deal with this. I don't know if you want to add something on the anti-Semitism before.
Oh, I can try. This is somewhat of an answer, and I think this is one of the reasons this tour is so important to me. Most of the people here, I assume, are supporters of justice and know a bit, so it's not my voice that I feel that is as important as Sahar's voice, as someone from the Jewish community, as it relates to BDS, and as it relates to finding these solutions. And so enhancing the voices, if it's anti-Semitic, then trying to deconstruct what that means and what the assumptions are and what is there. And one of the ways to the opposite of make legitimate, to
Delegitimize?
delegitimize, thank you, which is hard today. To delegitimize that voice is to showcase the voice of Semites in the way that they're perceived as Semites, so in this case, Jews, who are speaking out against the oppression and occupation of Palestinians. And there's a very large community of Jews, regardless of where they're from, how religious they are, how spiritual and all that, who are speaking out against this occupation and oppression. And so part of this is trying to connect our churches to those voices and add them to the voices that are supporting these different tough decisions and resolutions alongside the Palestinian voices who are also working on the ground with this, who can explain why we need this, why we need this change, and how as a Palestinian I can only see change through putting this pressure on the Israeli government. And one of the ways we can put this pressure is through BDS. So it's not the greatest answer, but I think that's very important to strengthen our ties with these different supportive voices.
Like, just when you were speaking and saying, you know, that my voice in this, like, how sad and racist is that my voice in that conversation matters more? That it's crazy. It's ridiculous.
I'm wondering if you could tell us who really benefits from this occupation?
Who what? Who really benefits?
Benefits.
That's a complicated question in the sense that there's a list of everyone who benefits financially. So if anyone wants to see who are the corporations that make a profit out of it, there's a website called whoprofits.org where you will get the majority of the organizations and companies around the world who profit from this bottom line. If you more specifically want to know what of your investments in your pension or whatever is invested in these companies, then there's another website called Investigate at AFSC where you can upload your portfolio and it'll give you a list of all those companies. So just to say, if any company comes up on that list, then you profit from it. You are part of the beneficiaries. That's what it means if your money's invested in these companies. So to say, to an extent, we all do. And I think that is important to say. But at the same time, I think that most of the people, I mean, as Israelis, we enjoy a lot of privileges. And a lot of those privileges are based on the occupation, right? The fact that I enjoy a certain standard of living as far as you know, the price of water that I pay is based on the fact that 70% of the West Bank water was taken away. I pay less for water. Resources, I mean, those are very daily things, which means that as an oppressive society, we all benefit from this. I do want to say that at the same time, there's a lot that we lose from this. And so it's a question of how do you measure benefit? And I think that we should be measuring it beyond bottom line, and also measuring it in how much are we as a society losing from the fact that Tarek and I can't work together more and can't have more of a conversation. And I mean, it's thinking culturally, thinking about what we could be building, think about the great potential. How much does Israeli Jewish society, how much is it lost from the fact that it made the Mizrahi Jews from Arab countries, erase their culture because it was Arab culture, because we're fighting the Arabs, so we had to erase that culture. How much could we have benefited if we would not have done it? So there's, I think, quite a lot to say about what could be benefited from not having that reality.